The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 11 million years, and they had done so through one simple tool that never failed them: fear. Every species that crawled out of their home world and reached for the stars would eventually discover the same terrible truth, that they were not alone and that the universe had owners. The Concord controlled over 900,000 star systems and commanded fleets that could darken the skies of entire worlds, and they maintained their empire through a ritual as old as their civilization itself: the warning. When a new species developed the technology to travel faster than light, the Concord would send them a message, and this message would appear on every screen and every device, and every radio frequency that the species possessed, and it would speak in every language that species had ever created. The message was simple: submit and integrate into the Concord, and serve the greater civilization, or be erased from existence. No negotiation and no compromise and no alternative. In 11 million years, this system had never failed, because every species responded in predictable ways. Some would grovel immediately and send messages of surrender before the warning had finished playing, and these species became servants and workers, and their worlds became property of the Concord. Others would try to negotiate, and they would send diplomats and offer treaties and beg for better terms, and the Concord would grant them small mercies in exchange for their total obedience. A few brave and foolish species would choose defiance, and they would broadcast threats and declarations of war and promises of vengeance, and the Concord would destroy them within days and leave their shattered worlds as monuments to the cost of resistance. Every species responded, and every species either submitted or died, and this was the natural order of the galaxy. Ambassador Kethrix of the monitoring cast had watched this ritual 912 times throughout his long career, and he had grown bored with it centuries ago, because the outcome was always the same. When the sensors detected a new faster-than-light signature emerging from a small yellow star system on the edge of the galaxy, he prepared himself for another routine observation. The species called themselves humans, and they came from a small blue world called Earth, and they had just completed their first successful jump drive test. Kethrix activated the warning protocol and watched as the message beamed toward Earth at speeds that would make it arrive before the human celebration had ended. He settled into his monitoring station and waited for the response that would surely come within hours. On Earth, the warning arrived during what the humans called a party. Scientists and engineers and politicians had gathered to celebrate the successful test of the jump drive, and they were drinking fermented beverages and laughing and dreaming of the stars when every screen in the facility went dark. Then the message began. It spoke in English and Mandarin and Spanish and Arabic and every other language humans had ever used, and it showed images of vast fleets and destroyed worlds and civilizations that had been reduced to ash. Submit or be erased. The room fell silent, and the champagne glasses stopped clinking, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then the chaos began. Governments convened emergency sessions, and militaries mobilized, and religious leaders proclaimed the end times, and billions of humans looked up at the stars with new fear in their hearts. Kethrix watched all of this with patient disinterest, because he had seen it all before. He waited for the transmission that would begin humanity's surrender, or the broadcast that would seal their destruction. He waited for 1 day, and then 2, and then a week. Nothing came. He checked his equipment and ran diagnostics and verified that all communication channels were functioning properly. Still nothing. Kethrix filed his first report with a note of confusion that he had never needed to include before. The humans had received the warning, and he could see evidence of their panic and their emergency meetings and their military preparations, but they had not sent any response to the Concord. Perhaps they needed more time to organize their government, he thought. He waited another month. During that month, the humans did something unexpected. They launched more ships, not warships, And not diplomatic vessels, but exploration craft and colony transports and scientific stations. They began expanding to their neighboring star systems as if the most powerful force in the galaxy had not just threatened to destroy them. Cathrix sent the warning again. The humans received it and discussed it and debated it in their governments and media. And then they continued building ships. He sent it a third time with additional footage of civilizations the Concord had destroyed and detailed descriptions of the military force that would be brought against them. The humans acknowledged receipt of the transmission and thanked the Concord for the information. Then they launched another colony ship. Cathrix requested a meeting with his superiors, and for the first time in his career, he used a phrase that had never appeared in a Concord monitoring report: status uncertain. His supervisor, ancient being named Voshin, reviewed the data with growing confusion. They have not submitted, Voshin said. No, Cathrix confirmed. They have not declared defiance. No. They have not requested negotiations or sent diplomatic envoys or made any attempt to contact us. They thanked us for the warning and then stopped responding. Voshin was silent for a long moment. What are they doing? Cathrix displayed the sensor data showing human expansion across a dozen star systems. They appear to be ignoring us. That is not possible. Voshin declared, no species ignores the Concord. These ones do. Voshin considered the situation with the weight of millions of years of institutional certainty, pressing against this impossible new reality. Send the warning again, he ordered, and prepare a preliminary incursion fleet. As you command. Cathrix returned to his station and sent the warning once more and began the paperwork for military deployment on Earth. The fourth warning arrived during a Tuesday afternoon. A junior communications officer noted the transmission and forwarded it to the appropriate department, where it was filed alongside the previous three. Then she went to lunch and talked with her friends about a movie she had seen the previous weekend. Somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of human government, a committee met to discuss the alien transmissions, and they produced a report that recommended continued non-engagement. The report was approved and filed and forgotten. Humanity had looked at the galaxy's demand and decided, collectively and without any grand declaration, that this was not their conversation to have. They had their own priorities and their own timeline and their own definition of what mattered. The Concord wanted submission or war. Humanity gave them nothing. And in the cold spaces between stars, Cathrix watched his screens and felt something he had never experienced in 900 years of service: uncertainty. 40 years had passed since the warning first reached Earth, and the Galactic Concord had never been more confused. Cathrix had been promoted 3 times during those decades, and each promotion came not from success, but from the simple fact that nobody else wanted to handle the human problem. He now held the title of Senior Analyst for Anomalous Species, and he was the only person who held that title because humanity was the only anomaly the Concord had ever encountered. The warning had been sent 47 times. 47 times the humans had received it and acknowledged it and filed it away somewhere in their bureaucracy. 47 times. They had continued expanding and building and living their lives as if the most powerful civilization in the galaxy was not threatening to destroy them. The Concord had tried everything they could think of. Within the bounds of the warning protocol, they sent the message in new formats with higher quality images and more detailed descriptions of the destruction that awaited defiant species. They sent footage of actual planetary bombardments, showing worlds being cracked open and populations being vaporized. They sent ambassadors in person who were received politely and offered something called coffee and small sweet foods called pastries, and then gently escorted back to their ships without any discussion of surrender. One ambassador reported that the humans had asked about Concord music and art, and whether the Concord had anything similar to a sport called basketball. They had not asked about the warning at all. High Arbiter Voshin convened the first emergency session of the Concord Council in 6,000 years, and every major species sent their representatives, and the chamber was filled with beings of crystal and light and flesh and energy, all focused on a single impossible question. What do we do about the humans? They are not ignoring us, Kethrix reported to the assembled council. Our intelligence confirms that every transmission has been received and reviewed by their governments. Then why do they not respond? Demanded a being of living flame, whose species had surrendered to the Concord 8 million years ago. We do not know, Kethrix admitted. They discussed the warning among themselves, and they have written extensive academic papers analyzing our civilization, and they have even made entertainment programs depicting various scenarios of Concord invasion entertainment, the flame being repeated with disbelief. Yes, and in many of these programs, they defeat us through various creative means, but they seem to treat the entire situation as a source of amusement rather than existential threat. Fleet Commander Jur rose from her seat, and her crystalline form pulsed with barely contained violence. This has gone on long enough, she declared. We deploy the Erasure Fleet and reduce their worlds to rubble, and this problem ends today. We tried, Kethrix said quietly. The chamber fell silent. What do you mean you tried? Voshin demanded. Kethrix activated a holographic display showing fleet movement records. 3 incursion attempts have been made over the past 15 years, and all 3 have failed. Failed how? Jur demanded. Our fleets do not fail. The first fleet experienced simultaneous mechanical failures across all vessels, and they were forced to return home for repairs, and the engineers could not determine what caused the malfunctions. Jur's form crackled with disbelief. The second fleet suffered a navigation error during their jump, and they emerged in empty space, 17,000 light years away from their intended destination, and by the time they reoriented themselves, their fuel reserves required them to return home. Navigation errors do not happen, Jur insisted. Our systems are perfect. The third fleet, Kethrix continued, simply vanished, and we received no distress signals and found no wreckage and detected no weapons fire, and one moment they existed, and the next moment they did not. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Accusations flew between species, and demands for investigation competed with calls for larger fleets and theories about human super weapons clashed with suspicions of internal sabotage. Voshin raised a manipulator appendage, and silence fell. What do the humans say about these incidents? Nothing, Kethrix replied. They've made no statements and claim no victories, and there is no evidence in their communications that they even know the fleets were sent. That is impossible. Many things about humans appeared to be impossible, and yet here we are. Jur slammed a crystalline appendage against the council table. Then, we send a larger fleet, and we send it with redundant systems and backup navigation, and we ensure that nothing can stop it. We could, Kethrix agreed, but there is another concern that the council should be aware of. He changed the holographic display to show a map of human expansion. In 40 years, they have grown from 1 star system to 47. And their population has increased from 8 billion to 80 billion, and their technology has advanced at a rate that our scientists describe as concerning. Concerning how? They are innovating faster than any species we have recorded, and they are not following the standard development paths that we have observed in other civilizations, and they are creating things that our scientists do not fully understand. The council considered this information with growing unease. There is one more thing, Kethrix added. They have made contact with 17 species currently under Concord control. Contact is forbidden, Jur declared. Yes, and yet it has happened. And the humans have been sharing information and technology and ideas with these species, and something strange has begun to occur. What? Kethrix hesitated because what he was about to say would shake the foundations of everything the Concord believed about itself. Those 17 species have stopped responding to us as well. The silence that followed was heavier than any the Council had known. For 11 million years, the Concord had maintained its empire through the certainty that every species understood the rules and that submission was the only path to survival. Now, 17 species had looked at humanity and seen something different, and they had chosen to follow that example. This is a disease, Voshin said slowly. The humans have infected our empire with their madness. Perhaps, Kethrix replied, or perhaps they have shown these species something we never wanted them to see. And what is that? That there is another option besides submission and death, and that option is simply to refuse to play the game at all. The Council debated for hours and then days, and they authorized larger fleets and more warnings and new strategies of intimidation. None of it worked. Humanity continued to expand and grow and thrive, and they continued to answer the galaxy's demands with nothing at all. And in the darkness between stars, more species began to fall silent. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been 12 years old when the warning first arrived, and she remembered that night with perfect clarity. She remembered her parents rushing her into the basement while the news showed riots in the streets, and she remembered the cold fear in her mother's voice as she explained that aliens had threatened to destroy Earth, and she remembered lying awake in the darkness, wondering if she would live to see her 13th birthday. That was 60 years ago. Now Elena was 72 years old, and she was the architect of everything that had happened since, and she was about to explain it all to beings who had traveled across the galaxy in secret just to meet her. The delegation from Kepler 442b consisted of 3 beings made of living light, and they had risked everything to come to Earth because they wanted to understand how humanity had done the impossible. Elena received them in a small room in a facility that did not officially exist, and she offered them tea, which they politely declined because they did not have mouths. "You have to understand," she began, "that the Concord operates on a very simple principle that has worked for 11 million years. The eldest of the light beings flickered with attention. That principle is reaction, and it means that everything the Concord does is designed to provoke a specific response from the species they encounter. We know this, the eldest said. They threaten and we submit or we die. Yes, but think about what that actually means, and think about what happens in both scenarios." Elena pulled up historical data on a display screen. When a species submits, they acknowledge that the Concord has power over them, and they enter into a relationship defined by the Concord's rules, and they become part of a system that the Concord controls. That is what happened to us, the eldest confirmed. And when a species fights, they also acknowledge that the Concord has power because you cannot fight. Something that you do not recognize as a threat in the act of fighting validates the Concord's position as the dominant force. The light beings flickered with something Elena had learned to interpret as confusion. So submission gives them power, and resistance gives them power. One of the younger beings said, "Then what option remains?" "The option that humanity chose." Elena smiled. "We refuse to acknowledge them at all, but they threatened to destroy you." "Yes, they did, and we received their message, and we discussed it and we analyzed it, and we held many meetings about what it meant. And then we decided collectively as a species that this was not our conversation to have." "How is that possible?" the eldest demanded. "The threat was real and your destruction was certain." "Was it though?" Elena leaned forward. "Think about what the Concord actually said, and think about what they were actually asking for." She changed the display to show the original warning message. They said submit or be erased. But they never actually demonstrated the ability to erase us, and they never proved that they could find us or reach us, or hurt us in any way. They showed images of destroyed worlds. They showed images of worlds that had responded to them, and those worlds had either submitted, which meant the Concord knew everything about their defenses, or they had fought. which meant they had revealed their military capabilities. Elena stood and walked to a window that looked out over a garden filled with flowers from a dozen different worlds. The Concord's power is not really military, although they have great military strength, and the foundation of their empire is psychological because they have built an entire civilization on the assumption that every intelligent species will respond predictably to threat. Submit or fight, the eldest said slowly. Exactly. And those are the only two options their system recognizes, and their entire infrastructure of control is built around managing species that have chosen one of those two paths. And humanity chose neither. Humanity chose to opt out entirely, and we received their message, and we said this is interesting. And then we went back to our own priorities, and our own goals, and our own definition of what matters. The light beings flickered rapidly among themselves in what Elena recognized as intense communication. But surely they attacked you, the eldest said. We have heard rumors of fleets sent against Earth. They tried 3 times in the early years, Elena confirmed, and all 3 attempts failed. How did you defeat them? We did not defeat them because defeat would have meant engaging with them and acknowledging the conflict and validating their framework. Elena returned to her seat, and her old bones protested the movement, but her mind remained as sharp as it had been 50 years ago, when she first proposed the doctrine of disengagement. Our defense systems do not fight their fleets, and they do not destroy their ships or kill their soldiers, because that would create a war, and wars require 2 participants. Then what do your defenses do? They redirect and they confuse, and they make problems go away without creating conflicts. And the first fleet experienced malfunctions that forced them to return home, and the second fleet got lost, and the third fleet was transported somewhere very far away where they could not hurt anyone. You have technology that can do this. We have technology that the Concord cannot understand because they have never needed to develop it. And for 11 million years, they have refined the tools of dominance and conquest and submission, but they have never needed to develop the tools of avoidance and misdirection and simple refusal. The eldest light being dimmed slightly in what Elena recognized as deep thought. You are saying that by not fighting you have become impossible to defeat. I am saying that by not fighting we have removed ourselves from the category of things that can be defeated, and the Concord knows how to handle enemies, and they know how to handle servants, but they do not know how to handle beings who simply refuse to be either. This is why you reached out to us, the eldest realized. You want to teach us this doctrine. I want to offer you a choice that you did not know you had. Elena corrected. The Concord taught you that there were only 2 options, but they were wrong, and there is a third option, and that option is to simply be yourselves and pursue your own goals and live your own lives without reference to what the Concord wants. They will try to destroy us. They will try, and they will fail because their entire system is built on species that play by their rules, and when you stop playing their game, they have no idea what to do. The light beings flickered among themselves for a long moment. We must return home and discuss this with our people, the eldest finally said. Of course, Elena agreed. Take all the time you need. One more question, the eldest said. What happens if enough species adopt this doctrine? And what happens if the Concord faces not one silent species but hundreds? Elena smiled, and in that smile was 60 years of patient strategy and quiet revolution. Then the game ends entirely, and the Concord discovers that their empire was always an illusion built on nothing more than the belief of their subjects. And what replaces it? Whatever we choose to build together. 200 years had passed since the warning first reached Earth, and the Galactic Concord was dying. Not from war, and not from rebellion, and not from any of the threats that their military strategists had prepared for across 11 million years of dominance. They were dying from silence. It started small with species that stopped attending. Council sessions and tribute shipments that arrived late and then arrived incomplete and then stopped arriving at all. Border disputes erupted between Concord members, and instead of requesting mediation from the High Arbiter, as they had done for millions of years, the species involved simply worked things out among themselves. When the Concord sent messages demanding explanations, they received polite responses thanking them for their concern and assuring them that everything was fine. When they sent threats, they received sympathy and well wishes, and sometimes flowers. The humans had taught the galaxy a new way of communicating, and that way involved saying nothing of substance while maintaining perfect politeness. High Arbiter Yenthus was young by Concord standards at only 4,000 years old, and he had inherited a position that his predecessors had held with absolute authority. And now he sat in a council chamber that was more than half empty. They call it the doctrine of disengagement, reported his chief analyst, a descendant of the original Kethrix, who had first encountered humanity. Over 300 species have adopted some version of it across the galaxy. 300, Yenthus repeated, and the number felt like a physical weight pressing against him. They respond to our communications with pleasantries, and they discuss weather patterns and cultural festivals, and they compliment our architecture, and when we issue demands, they thank us for our perspective and continue doing whatever they were doing before. Fleet Commander Kress, a being of pure energy constrained in a containment field, slammed against the council table with frustration. Then we make examples of them, Kress declared. We destroy a dozen worlds and remind the galaxy what happens to those who defy the Concord. We have destroyed 47 worlds in the last century. The analyst replied quietly, and the response, condolences. What? Several species sent condolences, expressing sympathy for our loss and hoping that we would find peace, and many sent flowers, which is apparently a human custom signifying compassion for the bereaved. Kress crackled with fury that made the containment field shimmer. We destroyed their allies, and they sent us flowers. They seem to believe that any species that must resort to violence has already lost something essential about itself, and they pity us. Pity, Kress spat the word like poison. We are the Concord, and we have ruled this galaxy for 11 million years, and they pity us. Yenthus raised a manipulator appendage to silence the fleet commander. What is the current state of our territory? The analyst hesitated before answering. Our effective control has decreased by approximately 60% over the past century, and species that once obeyed without question now simply ignore our directives and our tribute. Collection has fallen to levels that cannot sustain our military operations. And the humans. They now occupy over 2,000 star systems, and their population exceeds 1 trillion individuals, and they have formed what they call the network of free peoples, which includes over 400 species who have adopted their philosophy. 400, Yenthus said. That is more than the analyst mentioned before. The number grows daily, and species are joining faster than we can track them. Kress erupted from his seat. Then we destroy the humans, and we end this at the source. And once they are gone, the other species will return to obedience. We have sent 12 fleets against human space in the past 2 centuries, the analyst said. None have returned, and we do not know what happened to them. 12 fleets, Yenthus said slowly. That represents a significant portion of our military strength. Yes, High Arbiter, and we cannot afford to lose more. The council chamber fell. Silent, and in that silence, Yenthus heard something that no High Arbiter had ever heard before. The sound of an empire crumbling. There must be something we can do, he said finally. Some strategy, some approach that we have not tried. We could attempt to join them, the analyst suggested quietly. Every being in the chamber turned to stare at him. Join them, Kress repeated with disbelief. The network of free peoples accepts any species that agrees to their basic principles of mutual respect and non-coercion, and they have welcomed former Concord members without judgment. We are the Concord, Crest declared. "We do not join lesser civilizations, we rule them. With respect. Fleet Commander, we no longer rule anything, and our choice now is not between dominance and submission, but between relevance and obsolescence." Yenthis considered this for a long moment. What would joining them require? We would need to renounce our claims of authority over other species and acknowledge the right of all beings to determine their own futures and contribute to the network as equals rather than masters. That is everything we are, Crest protested. Without our authority, we are nothing. Perhaps the analyst agreed, or perhaps we discover that we can be something else, and something that does not depend on the fear and obedience of others. The debate continued for days, and then weeks and factions formed within the Concord, as some argued for one final desperate war, and others argued for surrender, and still others argued for the radical idea of simply becoming something new. Meanwhile, the galaxy continued to change around them. Species that had served the Concord for millions of years discovered that they could simply stop serving and nothing bad happened, and the feared retaliation never came because the Concord no longer had the resources to retaliate against everyone. Trade routes were formed around human space, where goods and ideas flowed freely without tribute or permission. Scientific knowledge that the Concord had hoarded was shared openly, and species that had been kept primitive began advancing rapidly. Art and music and stories spread across the network as cultures that had been isolated for millennia suddenly discovered each other, and through it all humanity continued to do what they had always done. They built and explored and created and lived their lives, and they welcomed anyone who wanted to join them, and they asked nothing in return except mutual respect. They had answered the galaxy's warning with nothing, and in that nothing, they had created space for everything else to grow. The Concord had ruled through fear for 11 million years. Humanity was teaching the galaxy that there were other ways to live. Ambassador Kethrix XVII was the direct descendant of the original Kethrix, who had first sent the warning to humanity 300 years ago, and now at the end of his long life, he had one final request. He wanted to visit Earth. The Concord barely existed anymore, as most of its member species had joined the network of free peoples or simply gone their own way, and the great fleets had been decommissioned, and the tribute halls stood empty, and the council chamber, where empires had been commanded, now served as a museum. Kethrix had spent his entire career studying humans and trying to understand how they had done what no other species had ever accomplished, and now before his time ended, he wanted to see their world with his own eyes. The humans welcomed him warmly, as they welcomed everyone. They gave him a small ship for personal travel, and they assigned him a guide named Yuki, who was 200 years old, thanks to human medical advances, and who had the patient wisdom that comes from watching centuries pass. She took him to see the wonders that humanity had built. Orbital rings circled Earth like jewelry, and space stations the size of cities floated in the darkness, and ships moved between the stars like thoughts moving between neurons. She showed him the terraformed moons of Jupiter, where forests grew under artificial skies and oceans teemed with life that humans had created or rescued from dying worlds. She introduced him to children who had been born in space and had never known the fear of alien invasion, because to them, aliens were simply neighbors and friends and trading partners. But it was on his last day that Kethrix finally found what he had been looking for. Yuki took him to a garden in what had once been called Japan, and she left him there with an old woman whose age he could not determine. The woman poured tea with hands that moved like flowing water, and she smiled at him with eyes that held centuries of wisdom. "You are a descendant of the first Kethrix," she said. "Yes, and you are Elena Vasquez. I was once, and now I am simply Elena." She was over 300 years old, and she had lived long enough to see everything she had planned come to fruition. And she had the peace of someone who knows their work is complete. Kethrix accepted the tea, although he could not drink it, and he held the warm cup in his manipulators, and felt something he had never expected to feel in the presence of a human. Comfort. I have to know, he said finally. All those years ago when my ancestors sent the warning and when your species faced extinction and when the most powerful civilization in the galaxy demanded your surrender, why did you not respond? Elena considered the question as birds sang in the trees around them and the wind carried the scent of flowers from a dozen different worlds. Do you know, she said, there is an old human story about the wind and the sun. I do not. The wind and the land. Sun argued over who was stronger, and they saw a traveler walking below, and they made a wager that whoever could make him remove his coat would be declared the winner. She paused to sip her tea. The wind blew with terrible force and tried to tear the coat from the traveler's body, but the harder the wind blew, the tighter. The traveler wrapped his coat around himself. And the sun. The sun simply shone warm and patient and steady. And after a while, the traveler grew warm and he removed his coat himself. Ketherick sat with this story for a moment. The warning was the wind. Yes, and it demanded that we react, and it assumed we would define ourselves in relation to the Concord either as servants or as enemies, and it never considered that we might choose to be something else entirely. And humanity chose to be the sun. We chose to simply be ourselves, warm and patient and steady, and we continued living our lives and pursuing our goals and building the future we wanted, and we let the galaxy remove its coat on its own terms. Ketherick set down his teacup. But what if my ancestors' people had destroyed you in those early years before your defenses were ready and before you had spread to other systems, and when you were vulnerable? Elena smiled, and in that smile was 3 centuries of peace. Then we would have been destroyed, and that was always a possibility, and we knew it, and we accepted it. How could you accept extinction? Because if we had survived by submitting, we would not have been ourselves anymore. And if we had survived by fighting, we would not have been ourselves anymore. And the only way to remain truly human was to live as humans live and die as humans die, without letting anyone else define what that meant. She reached out and touched his manipulator with gentle fingers. We could have sent a response, and we could have negotiated or surrendered or declared war. And we would have survived longer perhaps, but we would have become something else, and something shaped by the Concord's expectations and the Concord's rules and the Concord's definition of what we were supposed to be. So you chose to be nothing in their eyes. We chose to be everything in our own eyes. And that is the difference. The garden was quiet except for birdsong and the sound of water in a fountain, and somewhere in the distance children were laughing. I understand now, Ketherick said slowly. The nothing was not emptiness, and it was not absence, and it was simply refusing to be seen in the terms that others demanded. Yes, and when enough species refused to be seen that way, the entire framework collapsed, because it only worked when everyone agreed to participate. My people built an empire on fear for 11 million years, and now you are free to build something else. Ketherick looked around the garden at the flowers from distant worlds and the birds that had never known cages and the sky that stretched endlessly above. What will you build next? He asked. Elena laughed. And it was the laugh of an old woman who had seen empires rise and fall, and who knew that the best was still to come. Whatever we want, and that is the whole point. The afternoon light slanted through the trees, and Ketherick felt something he had never experienced in his very long life. Peace. The galaxy had issued a warning demanding that humanity choose between submission and destruction. Humanity had answered with nothing, and in that nothing they had created space for everything else to become possible. Ketherick stayed in the garden until the stars came out, and he watched them shine, and for the first time, he saw them not as territory to be controlled, or resources to be exploited, or threats to be managed. He saw them as possibilities, and he understood at last what humanity had been trying to tell the galaxy all along. The answer was never submission, and the answer was never war. The answer was simply this: we are who we choose. to be, and nothing you say or do can change that, and that was everything.